You know, if there is one thing I always believed in, it's giving someone a chance to prove themselves, whether it is something like a small business opening up or similar. I just like giving the startup people a chance and see what they have up their sleeves. Previously in my response videos, I was pretty much always punching up, tackling those creators that were massive compared to me at the time and had a much larger following, and were relatively well known. However, a few days ago in my recommendations, I received a curious video by someone new emerging in the BreadTube ecosystem, a channel called Bes D Marx, who very originally makes video essays and covers topics from a Marxist point of view. He has about 67,000 subscribers and actually receives a pretty decent amount of views on his videos, which lately have mostly been about Israel and Palestine. I mean, hey, I respect taking advantage of a conflict like that to flex your knowledge. He even surprisingly had one of his videos reacted to by none other than Hassan Piker himself. But having your video reacted to by Hassan is the left-wing equivalent of one of us getting noticed by Mr. Lating's catboy lover. Yeah, you know who I am referring to. So hey, props to him for even getting that far. So the video I was referring to is this one, How Nazism Survived in Germany, with the text in the thumbnail reading Re-enazification. Now, any rational being whose IQ is above 80 would naturally react something like this. But remember what I said in the beginning, let's try to be charitable here. At least with people like Hakim and Second Thought or Hassan Piker, one can use their God-given pattern recognition power to be able to tell where they will be going with their arguments. But we don't know about this guy. I frankly never heard of him or watched any of his videos before this one popped up in my homepage. So, you know, let's let him cook. Who knows, maybe he genuinely brings up good points and could be the most intellectual breadtuber I ever came across. So let's dive into that video and see what he has to offer. Lead the way, Mr. Marx 2.0. The stage is yours.
In Auschwitz wurde niemand umgebracht. Und ich sage es klipp und klar, leider wurde niemand umgebracht.
Now, just to clarify, his point in this video isn't about showing that there are still like Nazis around in Germany, which there are really, no debate there. Rather, as the thumbnail suggests, that there was a re-Nazification within the new German state itself, that the state is overlooking and responsible for National Socialism still being around. And that intro is kinda funny, because I question why that was in there. This guy, Thomas Dienel, in 1992, the same year in which that clip takes place in, he was convicted for sedition and sentenced to 2 years and 8 months in prison. So I don't exactly see how this supports his point in any way. The state literally did its job. Also, FYI, Dienel was born and grew up in Eastern Germany. So if you want to really make this point, this is more about Eastern Germany than it does Western Germany.
In the slipstream of the capitalist crisis, and with the support of crucial parts of the state itself, Nazism has been growing stronger in the Federal Republic of Germany almost unhindered for several years.
Okay, I absolutely have to call out this disingenuousness. He says in the video,
Nazism has been growing stronger in the Federal Republic of Germany.
But he shows a statistic on screen about the number of far-right extremists in Germany. I don't know whether anyone told you this, but not every right-wing extremist is a Nazi. The German right-wing extremist scene is pretty divided ideologically. You have the neo-Nazis, of course, then you have the Reichsbürger, who are basically the German equivalent of the sovereign citizen movement in some way. Then you have the extreme monarchists, and a few radical libertarians here and there. And all these groups fall under the label of right-wing extremist. Its rise does not necessarily indicate specifically a rise in National Socialism. If you wanted to prove that, you would have to pull out a statistic where people specifically refer to themselves as Nazis, and I think we all know why no one is willing to do that in Germany. And even the way the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution defines right-wing extremism is kinda vague. If you go to their website, they say it is characterized by, quote, elements of nationalist, anti-Semitic, racist, and xenophobic ideology. Right-wing extremists allege that a person's value is determined by the ethnic group or nation they belong to. Basically, according to the office that hands out these labels, a right-wing extremist is anyone who is nationalist and wants a Germany that serves the interests of Germans. So that is already a very wide net that will encompass many other groups, not just Nazis. We are not even 1 minute in and he was already disingenuous 2 times, a great sign of things to come in the following minutes.
And their entanglements deep into the state apparatus are becoming public again and again. The increasing right-wing terror against migrants and other minorities creates a climate of fear and insecurity. Meanwhile, the state is ramping up its repression against those fighting against Nazism to suffocate rising awareness and resistance in its infancy. Some weeks ago, anti-fascist Lina E received over 5 years for alleged attacks against neo-Nazis.
I don't know whether anyone told you this fact, Mr. Marx 2.0, but violence against individuals is a crime, no matter whether right-wing or left-wing. What happened with that Lina E case is that she was the leader of a left-wing lynching gang, which the court ruled to be a criminal organization. Her gang would carry out attacks against suspected Nazis around Saxony and Thuringia. And not just normal gang stuff, they were very well organized. They used fake IDs, wigs, stolen equipment, and burner phones to evade police. One of their victims, a guy called Tobias, was attacked with hammers and suffered a broken skull, and they even attacked a few protesters during the commemoration of the Dresden bombings. And one time in Thuringia, they attacked a local pub that was frequented by neo-Nazis with an explosive device, which resulted in no injuries. That's a fucking terrorist attack. Anyway, she was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Considering that track record, you'd expect her to get more than just 5 years, but the German legal system is lenient like that to left-wing individuals. And even the judge who delivered the verdict explicitly said that opposing right-wing extremism is a respectable motive, but that she can't go around beating people with hammers like that.
You can't do it, it's disgusting!
It's really wild that he used the Lina E trial as an example of
The state is ramping up its repression against those fighting against Nazism to suffocate rising awareness and resistance in its infancy.
Like, again, is he blaming the state for literally doing its job? Beating people with hammers is a crime, my guy, let alone leading a gang that attempted to do a terrorist attack. I already know this guy subscribes to the idea of our violence is good, but your violence is bad. I wouldn't be surprised if Marx 2.0 here wasn't aware of these things about the Lina E trial if he only looked at left-wing sources that don't emphasize the more serious aspects of her crimes, which is exactly why it's so important to look beyond just one side of the story. And that's where Ground News comes in, the sponsor of today's video. It's a tool I've been using to see the full picture of the news, what every side is saying, not just what fits into one narrative. What I love about it is that it actually helps you learn from the way other people, even your quote-unquote opponents, frame the same event. Take this recent story. The Netherlands has officially designated Israel as a security threat, which is a huge geopolitical shift. Ground News shows that 73% of the outlets covering this are left-leaning, with barely any right-leaning coverage at all. If you were only reading one side, you might not even know that this is happening, or you'd get such a one-sided angle that you'd miss the bigger implications entirely. With Ground News, I can see every perspective, who's reporting, what they emphasize, and how the framing changes. It kinda feels like a soldier stepping out of his cubicle and finally seeing the full battlefield. If you're tired of living in an echo chamber and want to understand the world instead of just having your own opinions echoed back, go to ground.news/Lavader. With that link, you'll get 40% off the Vantage plan, and you'll be able to cut through the spin and find the real story for yourself. Again, that's ground.news/Lavader. Start seeing the full picture today, and thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video.
In order to understand the developments in Germany, it is crucial to know about how and why Nazism managed to stay alive, and therefore to learn about the so-called period of denazification after World War II, where, far from eliminating Nazi influence, Nazism was deliberately spared and reintegrated into the new West German power structure, where it managed to survive to this day.
I know this was an absolutely horrible introduction, which kind of should tell how the rest of this video will go and what kind of stretches and leaps in logic he is prepared to make, but okay, let's see. You still have one more chance to impress us. Go ahead.
Most people have heard about the top Nazi leaders such as Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess being prosecuted after the defeat of Nazi Germany in the famous Nuremberg trials. What is less well known is that West German denazification was an utter failure when it comes to thoroughly punishing Nazis in the several trials that were conducted at the time. From 1946 until 2005, after absorbing the GDR, the Federal Republic of Germany convicted 6,656 people of Nazi crimes, and the vast majority of sentences, just under 5,000, were relatively mild, involving imprisonment of up to 2 years. Note that this is a teeny-tiny fraction of the over 200,000 perpetrators of Nazi crimes.
So, I actually checked out that statistic he is citing, with 200,000 perpetrators of Nazi crimes and 6,000 or so being convicted. Those stats come from Mary Fulbrook's book, Reckonings, Legacies of Nazi Persecution and the Quest for Justice. So, I purchased it and started checking it out. I was most interested in finding out what falls under the label of quote-unquote perpetrator of Nazi crimes according to her. Is it just those who directly ordered and carried out those crimes, or is that net much wider than we think? And she gives us that answer on page 117. Perhaps 200,000 people, and possibly closer to 1 million, were at one point or another actively involved in killing Jewish civilians, and the ranks of those who made this possible were far wider. People become variously involved according to the phases of the war and the scenes of persecution. Some were willing participants, some were pressured by their peers and learned to be brutal once in their role. Others felt constrained to act in certain ways, despite inner doubts and hesitations. Most later claimed that they bore no personal responsibility for their actions. So clearly, it's not just those who wrote orders and did shootings, but also those who, according to her, quote-unquote, became variously involved. In fact, she generously gives us an example in the beginning pages of the book on what she means. We have come to think in terms of a triad: perpetrators, victims, and bystanders, and some who were victims later came to be seen as survivors. Yet these labels are not always easily applied. Even at times of persecution, people could move between categories. Many people collaborated or assisted in the process of persecution, even though they would not, in conventional terms, be labeled perpetrators. Many were victims of Nazi policies in one context, yet beneficiaries or even perpetrators in another. Polish people, for example, were on the receiving end of Nazi oppression and were victims of brutal occupation policies. Yet some also assisted the Nazis in hunting Jews. Others might hide Jews for a while, thus becoming rescuers, but then turn them in when fear or considerations of material gain took priority. Some might participate in partisan bands resisting the Germans while betraying Jews who tried to join them. Meaning that, if you are a Polish person hiding your Jewish neighbor somewhere in your attic and an SS guy comes over and threatens to kill your whole family if you don't hand the guy over, and if you comply for the sake of keeping your family safe, you would be among those in that number of 200,000 Nazi perpetrators. Marx 2.0 here wants you to believe that this number includes all those who directly participated and ordered the crimes, but it also includes things like Polish partisans refusing to save Jews and leaving them to the Germans. If that's how wide the requirement is to be seen as a perpetrator of Nazi crimes, then this number right here starts to make a lot more sense and doesn't seem that wild anymore. But you also have to keep in mind how the German legal system operated when persecuting and reviewing cases. They want to mitigate a full-on collective punishment, and they rightfully saw that many people could also be deemed as cogs in the machine. You know, it would kinda be stupid to convict a janitor cleaning the building used during the Wannsee Conference for crimes against humanity because he overheard some superiors talking about killing Jews. Then there was also the lack of resources to investigate and prosecute every single individual, not to mention that numerous also managed to flee and get away. So for all of these reasons, the vast majority of trials were focused on 1. High-ranking leaders like the Nuremberg trials, and 2. Those directly linked and involved in mass killings. And in order to be in the latter camp, you had to either be the guy who gave out the order or the guy who pulled the trigger. Those two kinds of people were prosecuted for these crimes, meaning that if you have a middleman somewhere in there, like a guy who just sends out and delivers the order, or a truck driver merely delivering resources and equipment, he would not be considered a perpetrator in this regard. Only those involved in direct killing were convicted. And then there is also the fact that you needed very concrete and direct evidence of participation, which was extremely hard to prove for those who were just following orders in administrative roles. So is it any surprise then that out of those 200,000, only about 6,000 or so were convicted, considering who falls under the label of perpetrator, who would be brought to court, and whether there was even direct and concrete evidence to convict them? It's not because the Germans or allies were intentionally turning a blind eye, they genuinely wished to avoid a collective punishment, since pretty much everyone was involved with the Nazis in some way, shape, or form, so they made sure only to punish those directly involved in the mass killings.
Up until the end of the 20th century, only 164 Nazis were eventually sentenced for murder, compared to the hundreds of thousands of individuals complicit in the massacre of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. And I want you to keep in mind that anti-fascist Lina E got over 5 years in prison for allegedly beating up Nazis, while the vast majority of those convicted, literal participants in the Nazi killing machine, didn't even receive 2 years.
Murder and being an accessory or accomplice in murder are two different categories, my friend. If you received the order to shoot a Polish guy in the head, you would be charged as an accessory to murder, but the guy who gave out that order would be charged with murder. Let me give an example. Let's say a senior officer decides that a whole village needs to be razed with all survivors killed. He relays that order to a junior officer, and then that junior officer orders his soldiers to carry out that act. The soldiers and the junior officer would be charged as accomplices, but the senior officer, the guy with whom that order originated in the first place, would be charged with murder. It depends on personal initiative. Did that order originate with him, or is he just carrying it out? So again, not too surprising that about 164 of them were convicted for murder, which was mostly among the higher-ups. I mean, just look at the trial of the the SS Einsatzgruppen, which were death squads personally responsible for mass murder. After the war, 24 senior Einsatzgruppen officers were brought before trial. Well, technically 22 made it to the end since the other 2 died due to suicide or illness. And guess how many were found guilty for murder alongside other crimes? Every single one of them, 100% conviction rate. 14 got a death sentence while 8 of them got a prison sentence up to life in prison. Now, if what Marx 2.0 says is true, the conviction rate for the Einsatzgruppen would definitely not be 100%. It just shows that the legal system had a clear hierarchy with who would be tried for what.
The half-assed denazification efforts didn't cause outrage among all people in Germany. If anything, a considerable amount of the population who remained in denial about the Nazi crimes opposed these efforts, dismissing the Nuremberg trials conducted by foreign powers as victors' justice. Germany was once again portrayed as the victim. This is no surprise, since a large section of the German population had been supporters of Hitler. 43.9% had voted for the Nazi Party in 1933, with some estimating an even higher percentage of support in the 40s. And they did not turn anti-fascist all of a sudden after the war.
Okay, now he's just trying to apply collective blame on Germans as a whole. If that wasn't bad enough, I have to point out, people can have their views and opinions changed over time. Someone who voted for Hitler in 1933 could have become disillusioned with him or perhaps could have even opposed him by 1945. And keep in mind, the majority of people who voted for the Nazis in 1933 didn't vote for them due to their racial policies and anti-Semitism. They voted out of economic concerns in hopes that they would fix the economy. At the end of the day, the concern over whether you will have enough money next month to feed your family is most definitely a bigger concern than wanting your Jewish neighbor to move out and never come back again. If you look at the 1928 German federal election results, the NSDAP only received 2.6% of the vote with only 12 seats in parliament. Then, in 1929, came the Great Depression, which hit Germany particularly hard, and that's when the popularity of the NSDAP soared. You know, conveniently during times of an economic crisis. My point being, not every voter had it out for racial minorities in 1933. For a lot of Germans, naturally, the economy mattered the most, and what Hitler promised them, that he would end the crisis and make sure every German has a stable job, was too good of a promise for many to pass up, particularly if the old parties proved to not be reliable in fixing the economy. Between 1941 to 1945, the popularity of Hitler and the Nazis really tanked among the German population, and a lot of them had grown sick of him. Many who were ideologically aligned with him from the beginning also started to turn on him. Richard J. Evans in his book Hitler's People mentions Louise Solmitz, a conservative nationalist who admired Hitler initially and voted for him in 1933, but started to lose faith in him in 1942. This is what Evans writes. Now she had only hate and curses for Hitler. I got into the habit of accompanying every bomb with a "let Hitler die a miserable death" when we were amongst ourselves, she wrote. The family started to refer to the Nazis as Herr Jaspers, allowing them to discuss the decline and the coming end of the Nazi system without fear of being arrested if anyone overheard them. Every time Goebbels or another leading Nazi came on the radio, they rushed across the room to switch it off. Louise's attitude to the Third Reich was now being driven by her role as a mother and grandmother, a role that mingled with her disillusion at the state to which Hitler's policies had brought Germany to produce a diametrical reversal of the adulation she had felt a decade before. Again, the point of this is really stupid, because first of all, you can't apply collective blame like that, and second of all, people have the ability to change their minds on certain ideas and people. 9 years ago in 2016, I was unironically a big fan of Hillary Clinton and prayed that she would win the 2016 election, and I still vividly remember coming home from school and cursing out loud when I heard Trump won. Am I a big fan of her now in 2025? Absolutely not. And it would be stupid for me to be tried by the quote-unquote upcoming Trump dictatorship leftists fantasize about as a Hillary supporter because of an opinion I had 9 years ago. The exact same thing applies here.
It's important to remember that many representatives of the ruling classes in other countries didn't have a problem with fascism in general, but only where fascism endangered their own sphere of influence. Communism was the main danger to capitalism, and fascism was correctly regarded as an effective tool against communist influence. Quote, "Fascism has rendered a service to the whole world. Hereafter, no great nation will be unprovided with an ultimate means of protection against the cancerous growth of Bolshevism," said Winston Churchill in a speech he gave in Rome in 1927.
I was extremely suspicious about that Churchill quote he used, and had a strong feeling there was some kind of context missing there, and that he was framing it in a certain way. So I searched it up, and lo and behold, I was right. Churchill wasn't talking about fascism as a whole, but merely fascism in Italy. Yes, he was talking about Italy, so I have no idea what this is doing in a video about Germany. And if you actually read that thing of his further, he makes it clear that he is distancing himself from any advocacy of fascism in Britain, saying, quote, "But in Great Britain we have not yet had to face this danger in the same form. We have our own particular method of doing things." So yeah, props to Marx 2.0 here for taking quotes out of context.
So instead of describing denazification as a failure, we have to see the adoption of fascism as a logical consequence of class society. Whether it's fascism in the form of an actual government system, or the use of the fascist movement in the service of capital, e.g., either actively collaborating with the Freikorps or the Fasci to crush communists, or just integrating fascist elements in the state apparatus, such as the police, whether consciously or unconsciously, to secure a counter-revolutionary basis for the worst case. In other words, you cannot denazify class society.
Okay, he finally revealed to us where this opinion of his comes from that denazification never really happened. He sees fascism through the usual Marxist lens of it being capitalism in decay, that fascism is a backup the bourgeoisie can use when communists are a serious threat to them and their wealth, meaning that wherever there is capitalism, there is fascism. You cannot separate the two, so that's why from his perspective denazification failed or really never happened, because fascism will inevitably always exist within a capitalist system. That's an inherently ideological way of looking at it. We'll not get into all that right now since there is a lot to go over. I made a dedicated video on that topic as well as addressed it in my video where I debunk Hakim on fascism. This, again, perspective only makes sense if you are a Marxist and believe fascism is capitalism in decay, but if you don't, his entire premise falls flat on his face.
Take all the companies and their bosses who had financed Hitler's rise to power, who collaborated with the Nazi regime and profited from forced labor and mass murder in the concentration camps. The Thyssens, the Flicks, the Quants, the Porsche Piechs, the Oetkers, most of them faced little to zero consequences.
Companies and bosses were not punished. Really? Really? Let me ask you this. What happened to IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that produced the infamous Zyklon B as well as managed rubber and oil plants? It was completely broken up and all their assets seized, and was divided into 12 successor firms. All the big boys in the company were tried and the majority convicted in the IG Farben trial after the war. Or, another example, Krupp. Krupp was the German steel industry. It was perhaps one of the biggest monopolies that ever existed in history. Guess what happened? All the big boys were prosecuted in the Krupp trial, with all of them being found guilty except for the head of the sales department who was acquitted. The Allies tried to break up Krupp with limited success, and Alfred von Krupp was only handed back leadership over the company because no one was willing to buy the Krupp holdings. Nevertheless, Krupp never really managed to regain its monopoly status and had to compete with other firms after World War II. It's also funny how he brings up Fritz Thyssen in the video as among those who quote-unquote got away with it. Fritz was an early supporter, but he cut ties with the Nazis in 1939 due to Kristallnacht, fled Germany, and then had his assets seized by the state. After the war, he was judged a lesser offender and fined approximately 15% of his assets. So, if I was him, Thyssen would not be one of the guys I would put up there. The only ones who really got away with it were the Porsche and the Utkas, but to say that none of the industrialists faced any consequences is just laughable. There were literally trials specifically for the companies, like IG Farben, Krupp and the Flicks.
Industrialist Günther Quandt, whose ex-wife was married to Joseph Goebbels, expanded the family wealth at the expense of concentration camp prisoners or through expropriating competitors, mostly Jewish, and became a major producer of armaments and industrial goods, boosting the war machine of the Third Reich. However, no charges were brought against him at the Nuremberg trials, despite initial investigations. The Quandts are the wealthiest family in Germany today.
The reason Quandt faced no charges is because at the time when they held him in custody, no one really knew the extent of his involvement and there was a lack of evidence connecting him to war crimes and slave labor. They just branded him as a fellow traveler of National Socialism and let him go. The true extent of his involvement only came to light in 2007, when a documentary came out implicating the family and Günther in the use of slave labor during the Third Reich. Apparently, the Quandts themselves weren't aware of the involvement and funded a whole research project after the documentary came out to examine the family's activities during the period, and the report concluded that they were linked to the crimes of the Nazis. Benjamin Ferenc, one of the prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials, himself came out and said that if today's evidence against Günther Quandt had been presented to the court at the time, Quandt would have, quote, been charged with the same offenses as Flick, Krupp and the directors of IG Farben. So yeah, Günther Quandt didn't get away because the legal system turned a blind eye. They lacked any concrete evidence at the time linking him to the crimes, and only way after his death did the true extent of his involvement become known.
Nazism this, Nazism that, Nazis, Nazis, Nazis. The West German ruling class got sick of hearing about denazification over and over. They've had enough of it. Schluss mit Entnazifizierung, End Denazification, was a campaign slogan of the FDP, which is part of the so-called center-left government coalition in Germany today.
What the hell does that have to do with anything? Did he just unironically present a campaign slogan of a political party calling for the end of denazification as evidence that the entire West German ruling class wanted to call off and end denazification? Holy shit, I don't even know what to call this stretch, Jesus Christ. So apparently I can just point to a campaign slogan of any random political party and then claim that the entire ruling class adheres to this. What an argument.
Stoking the fear of the Red Menace, Adenauer would say, quote, "In a moment you will hear a cabinet resolution that we passed this morning, the aim of which is to ruthlessly remove all supporters of communism from positions in the Federal Republic, whether they are workers, employees, or civil servants." The context was a resolution that the new government passed in 1950 called the Decree Against Enemies of the Constitution, or the so-called Adenauer Decree. While it's worded neutrally, its thrust was clear. Of the organizations named in it, 11 are communist, but only 2 are right-wing extremists.
You know, maybe the reason why there were 11 communist organizations named and only 2 right-wing extremist ones is because there weren't that many right-wing extremist ones left after the war, but plenty of communist ones. I mean, come on, it really doesn't take that much brainpower to come to this conclusion.
The decree was the prelude to further legal measures against the left-wing opposition. Adenauer targeted not only the Communist Party of Germany and its sympathizers, but also popular resistance to the remilitarization that he sought. While persecuting communists, Nazis were slowly but surely led back to occupying key positions in the new German state.
Did he just show a picture of Hans Speidel, the guy who not only never was a member of the NSDAP and criticized the racial aspects of the ideology, but also the guy who was fucking involved in the 20th of July plot? Honestly, this right here scares me. I am prepared to see what kind of stretches this man is about to make about other figures and the extent of their involvement with the Nazis.
Among the many Nazi military leaders who were reintegrated into the West German army was Adolf Heusinger, who had served as an operations chief in the Wehrmacht. He later became the head of the West German military and the chairman of the NATO Military Committee.
Adolf Heusinger was a career professional soldier. There is no record that Heusinger ever joined the NSDAP or formally identified as a National Socialist, meaning he was a high-ranking Wehrmacht general, not a party official or ideological leader, so he cannot be labeled as a Nazi. He was involved in the planning of major offensives like the invasion of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, and he also coordinated anti-partisan warfare from time to time. So, I really don't see anything wrong here in regards to him being rehabilitated and involved in the rearmament and NATO.
The chief of staff of the German Chancellery, the quote, left and right hand of Adenauer, Hans Globke, had written the commentary on the Nuremberg race laws, which determined who was a Jew, thus deciding who was persecuted and who was locked up in concentration camps. He now said, quote, "The German people knew as little as I did."
Globke's only real contribution to the Nuremberg laws was one legal annotation, which is a short explanation or comment added to a legal text. That was his only real contribution to it. He didn't write any of the things there personally. And Globke was a bureaucrat, and a very experienced one at that, which is why he was recruited into the West German government, due to his know-hows. Again, remember what I said, the Third Reich was a one-party state. In order to get into any kind of bureaucracy and work there, you had to be a member of the party. And West Germany could not afford to tell every single bureaucrat to fuck off since, they were the only ones experienced in running things like a country. And try to imagine how difficult it is to build up a new bureaucracy from the ground up consisting of a little more than 1 million people while not having a bureaucracy in the first place. If you want to see a nation that did exactly that, look at modern-day Iraq, where they barred anyone even remotely associated with the Baathists from any kind of position in government or bureaucracy. Another one-party state where membership was mandatory to get into those positions in the first place. And yeah, Iraq is not looking too good today, because everyone who knew how to run things was given the middle finger and told to screw off. So for that reason, only the top ones in the bureaucracy directly linked to things like murder weren't let back in. I mean, for God's sake, the Soviet Union also literally did the same thing when it was first established, recruiting former Tsarist officers and bureaucrats for their know-hows because none of them knew how to run a country yet or lead an army. This is nothing unheard of.
Then there were those Nazis who were key people in the foundation of international bodies, such as Walter Hallstein, who became one of the founding fathers of the European Union.
Again, just like with the guys before, Hallstein was never a member of the NSDAP. Because he was a teacher, he had to be a member of some organizational bodies associated with the party, like the National Socialist Teachers League, since again, it was mandatory to be in these if you wanted to be a teacher, but he was never a member of the party itself. In fact, the party opposed his appointment as professor of law at the University of Frankfurt because they saw him as politically unreliable. He got drafted in the Wehrmacht later and was captured as a POW by the Americans. That's his story, and again, I see nothing really incriminating here. I feel like this guy's only real research about these people was him going to their Wikipedia page, seeing Allegiance Nazi Germany, and then going apeshit.
And Kurt Waldheim, who became Secretary General of the United Nations and President of Austria.
First of all, Waldheim is Austrian. I don't know why you would bring him up in a video about Germany. Second of all, Waldheim was an intelligence officer in the Balkans, and you wanna know what his job was? It was translating shit from German to Croatian and from Croatian to German. That's it. That's what he did during the war, nothing more. He never gave out orders or led any kind of campaigns. He just sat in his little cubicle and translated stuff from morning till dawn. Now obviously, being a translator, he must have been aware of some of the war crimes going on. He claims otherwise, but it's obvious he knew. But still, he never committed them or ordered them. So frankly, again, I see absolutely no issue here.
These examples are only a fraction of all the Nazis holding powerful positions in the police, in government and all the ministries, or in the judicial system. And don't get the wrong impression that Nazis only occupied supportive secondary offices. No, they were part of the highest echelons of power. The later Chancellor of Germany, Kurt Georg Kiesinger, had been a Nazi Party member from 1933. Kiesinger would accelerate the reintegration of Nazis and would successfully campaign against the banning of the NPD, a neo-Nazi party that exists to this day.
Doesn't that kinda defeat your point, my man? Why would a Nazi campaign for the banning of a Nazi party? Like, all you've shown is that Kiesinger was a Nazi, if we assume Nazi party membership necessarily equals Nazi belief, and then later changed his views and became anti-Nazi. Again, that's the thing I talked about. People can change their views. Let's assume for a moment, okay, that the entire West German power structure was made up of former Nazis. Emphasis on that former part. Does that necessarily make them a Nazi after the war, if you get what I mean? Like, if you wrote an article sometime in 1936 about how great Hitler was and that you hated the Jews, does that automatically mean you will have those same opinions 9 years later in 1945? That's the big question, but communists like our boy Marx 2.0 here would never consider that a possibility because they don't believe in idealism. They are staunch materialists. Your allegiances and what you believe in depend on your material conditions and what class you belong to. You can't be swayed to another stance simply through dialogue or thinking about stuff. That is why for them, if you are once a Nazi, you are always a Nazi. They don't care if you later had your mind changed. Your material conditions do all the talking for you, unless they have changed as well. That's why our boy here could never comprehend this simple thing and possibility. Idealist bros stay winning.
The response of the West German government was to point out how Nazis were reintegrated in the East as well. And you'll hear this line of defense today as well from liberals and conservatives. What about East Germany, they'll ask. Now, to be sure, it is true that former NSDAP members found their way into the East German state as well. But the comparison is laughable. Denazification in the Soviet zone had been a much higher priority, even to the point of being criticized as being too harsh. Large landowners and the so-called Junkers, who were also often former Nazi supporters, were quickly expropriated in the East, while West German parties started to urge the Allied powers to stop denazification. It was not until years later when the West German politicians started pointing the finger back to the East. In fact, a huge amount of Nazis fled to the West, convinced they would get away with much less punishment. And they were right. A total of 12,890 sentences were passed in East Germany, almost double the number in the West, despite East Germany having less than 1/3 of the population of West Germany. And that despite the massive transfer of Nazis from East to West.
Oh, you sweet summer child. Looks like somebody has decided to start throwing stones from within their glass house. Absolutely not comparable to the West. Do not make me laugh. In fact, I was actually watching this video with a good friend of mine, and I'm just gonna show you the clip of his reaction to that part when it came up.
But the comparison is laughable.
You're shitting me! This guy cannot be for real, right? No way!
While it may be true that the East convicted twice as many former Nazis as the West, I have some rather interesting figures to show you. Do you know how many members of the Communist State Party in the East formerly were also members of the NSDAP? Well, considering how harsh Marx 2.0 here is with the West, it would be near zero, right? Wrong. 27%. 1 in 4 of every member of the ruling communist SED party was a former member of the NSDAP, and 32% of all public income employees at the time in the East once belonged to Nazi organizations in the past. And you wanna know what makes all of this worse? The SED created a satellite political party with the intent of attracting and representing former members of the Nazi Party. I am not joking. It was called the National Democratic Party of Germany, and the logic was that by giving these guys an outlet, they would not be tempted by anti-communism. Not even Western Germany did something like this. And the leader of the SED in 1958, Walter Ulbricht, was confronted about being so lenient towards former Nazis, and he answered with, "We are not asking whether someone was formerly a private entrepreneur or an officer in the Hitler army, but we are already so strong in the National Front that even reversing of upward forces is absolutely possible." And don't even get me started on the Stasi, the state security service in East Germany, which was basically a copy-paste of the Gestapo. If you did a bit of digging, you would have found that a lot of agents and those involved with the Stasi had interesting background, so to say. They even had former SS officers, not Wehrmacht officers, fucking SS officers working there. One example is Heinz Felfe, who served in the SS and had the rank of Obersturmführer. He was recruited by the KGB after the war and was a professor in East Berlin's Humboldt University, where Stasi operatives were trained in criminology. Yeah, all of this is a lot more than just a few Nazis here and there slipping through the cracks. Now, I personally would never hold this against East Germany, since I understand they needed the know-hows and recruited them due to their skills. But you can't hold all of these things against West Germany, but then shrug it off when it comes to East Germany and claim that they are not comparable. Absolutely they are comparable, and if anything, I would go as far as to say that East Germany did it more. And if we go by the logic of our friend here, the AfD party is the strongest and most popular in East Germany compared to West Germany, and he considers the AfD to be a Nazi party. So, if we look at it through this lens, tell me, which side was more successful at denazification?
In the German Democratic Republic, individuals recognized as fighters or victims of fascism were provided with additional pensions and other privileges as a way to acknowledge their suffering. On the other hand, Nazis were granted generous pensions in the West, while those who had fought against the Nazis and were interned in concentration camps received no pensions for those periods because they were considered not to have made the necessary contributions during that time.
Okay, that's just an outright lie right there. West Germany passed compensation laws in 1953 like the Federal Compensation Act or Bundesentschädigungsgesetz. Persecuted individuals like Jews and political prisoners became eligible for monthly compensation payments and pension-like allowances. West Germany also signed bilateral compensation agreements with countries such as Israel, France, Greece, Italy, and others, paying hundreds of millions of Deutschmarks to victims abroad. Now okay, in contrast to East Germany, West Germany did not offer a dedicated honorary pension system linked to anti-fascist resistance, but the scope of what they were already paying under the compensation laws was more than enough, so don't pretend like West Germany never gave out a single penny to victims. Anyway, I think I will be finishing here with 6 more minutes of the video to go. He does the exact same things we have seen him do. Oh, some people who served in the West German Foreign Office had an NSDAP party book. Oh, a lot of former Nazis used to work in the Ministry of Interior, blah blah blah. Nothing I haven't already argued to death here in this video. Denazification was an ideological program, not a program of the removal of anyone remotely associated with National Socialism. All the worst offenders who ordered and committed the crimes were tried and convicted, and Germany moved into the phase of the ideological destruction of National Socialism through things like rehabilitation and education. To say that Germany was re-Nazified while doing the salute and displaying the symbols or denying the Holocaust could land you a few years in prison and a hefty fine is laughable. Notice how he never talked about Germany ideologically getting rid of the Nazis. Rather, this whole video is basically a guy who worked in the bureaucracy under Hitler also worked in a bureaucracy in West Germany. Thus, West Germany never denazified. Like, that's so genuinely stupid, I don't even know how to properly address it. But I guess if you view this all through the Marxist lens, it makes sense. But for the majority of us who don't, all of these arguments don't really hold that much water. I should have listened to my pattern recognition. Why is every breadtuber I come across like this? From where I'm standing, it will be a cold day in hell before an actual intellectual breadtuber enters the scene. But for now, I guess we are stuck with the idiots who say stuff like, a political party had a certain campaign slogan for denazification, and this means the entire German ruling class did not want denazification anymore. I am actually planning and working on a video of my own on denazification and the broader impact it has had on German culture. But until that point, I guess I will see you guys in the next video. Now leave me alone please, I need to take a 2-hour walk to recover. Thanks to all the glorious people on Patreon who are supporting me in these endeavors. Special thanks to Mudkips Our Life and SOAV for their extremely generous and high pledges. That really helps me out a lot. Anyway, bye bye!